Welcome to the Borderscape project seminar series. I know that most of you know what Borderscape is about, but for the few who don't, the Borderscape project investigates state formation in Egypt and how this process changed and impacted socio-spatial landscape of the Nile First Cataract region in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. So the team working in the Borderscape project is me, the PI, and then there is Oren Siegel, Dr. Oren Siegel, who is the junior researcher. The project is founded by the Norway Grants, working together for a green, competitive and inclusive Europe, and by the National Science Center in Poland. And this is done through the Pulse call of the NCN. The project is based at the Institute of Mediterranean and Oriental Cultures of the Polish Academy of Sciences. If you want to know more about the project, please go to our website, and there you will find also links to our social media pages. And I want to remember to everyone that today we are going to record the seminar, and it will be put online soon, we hope, to the YouTube channel of the Institute. So today's seminar is the first seminar and is presented by Professor Chiara Brambilla, and the title is Rethinking Borders through the Borderscaping Looking Glass, a collaborative ethnographic research in the Italian-Tunisian borderscape. Chiara Brambilla has a PhD in anthropology and epistemology of complexity from University of Bergamo in Italy, where she is an associate professor of anthropology at the Department of Human and Social Sciences. Her research focuses on anthropology, critical geopolitics, and epistemology of borders, border studies and border theory, the Mediterranean border migration nexus, border aesthetics, landscapes, territories and identities, borders in Africa, colonialism and post-colonialism. Professor Brambilla's scholarship has been influential in developing the concepts of borderscape and borderscaping, and seminal are two of her articles published in 2015 in the journal Geopolitics. She has published widely in her field within Italian and international journals and volumes. In 2009, she has authored a monograph in Italian titled Ripensare le frontiere in Africa, il caso Angola, Namibia e l'identità kwanyana, which translated into English would be Rethinking African Frontiers, the case of Angola, Namibia, and the identity of the Kwanyama. In 2010, she has edited with Bruno Riccio the volume Transnational Migration, Cosmopolitanism, and Dislocated Borders. And 5 years later, in 2015, with Jassy Lane, James Scott, and Gianluca Bocchi, the book titled Borderscaping, Imaginations and Practices of Border Making. She is associate member of the Nijmegen Center for Border Research in the Netherlands and regional editor for Europe of the Journal of Borderlands Studies. Professor Brambilla has been an official academic advisor for the project Temporalities and Subjectivities of Crossing Contemporary Public Migration Narratives in Europe, based at University of Oslo and founded by the Committee for Nordic Research Councils in the Humanities and Social Sciences. She has been also a team member of the interdisciplinary project Border Aesthetics, based at University of Tromsø, and founded by the Norwegian Research Center. So, as you can see, we are not the only one with a connection to Norway. Before giving the floor to Professor Brambilla, I would like to thank her for the enthusiastic acceptance of this challenge of presenting her anthropological ethnographic research to an audience that is only made of archaeologists and Egyptologists. So, Chiara, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see the screen, my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you very much, Maria. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I would like to thank you, Maria, and the other organizer once again for inviting me to participate in this stimulating seminar series, which allows me to establish a dialogue with archaeologists and Egyptologists who still are at the margins of the international border studies community. So it's a great pleasure for me to have this chance today to establish a kind of interdisciplinary dialogue with this community of archaeologists. So thank you very much for this invitation. So in my today's seminar, I would like to explore with you the critical, conceptual, but also methodological and applied potential of the emerging conceptualization of the border as a borderscape and the borderscaping approach, as well as its interactions with a border aesthetic approach to investigate images, imaginations, and practices of border making and the border migration nexus from the geopolitical level to the level of social practices, cultural production, and everyday life. At the same time, showcasing the potential of border research as an interdisciplinary field with its own academic standing. Over the past few years, I have been investigating the conceptual, methodological, and practical potential of what I term the borderscaping approach, adopting an interdisciplinary perspective crisscrossing different human and social sciences, and mainly anthropology, geography, political philosophy, and visual studies. Specifically, my conceptual and empirical research work has focused on the potential of the borderscaping approach to inquire into contemporary Mediterranean neighborhood imaginaries and to investigate the complexity of the border migration nexus. I have been conducted my multi-sited ethnographic research in the Italian-Tunisian borderland, starting from the EU Borderscape project, working on two case studies, the Italian-Tunisian borderland and the relationship between the city of Mazara del Vallo in Sicily, in Italy, and the city of Mahdia in Tunisia, and the island of Lampedusa, mainly focusing in this second case on counter-hegemonic cultural and artistic experiences. And my reflection here is also closely related to my previous participation in the transdisciplinary border aesthetic project coordinated by the University of Tromsø in Norway, as Maria previously introduced. After sharing with you my conceptual and methodological reflections on the potential of the borderscaping and border aesthetic approach to rethink borders and the border migration nexus in contemporary Mediterranean scenarios, I will provide examples from my multi-sited collaborative ethnographic research with young people in the Italian-Tunisian borderland that serve to inquire into conceptual, methodological, and applied potentialities of borderscaping. Rethinking borders through the borderscaping lens allows us to grasp the complex relations which are often overlooked that thinking borders has with acting and inhabiting borders, being a useful tool for a critical reflection not only at the heuristic level, but also at the methodological and applied level. Okay. In the light of this, the background image that you can see is not there by chance, but it's very much connected to the main points of my talk today. It's a piece of art titled La parola luce, the light word, It is a piece of art by Giacomo Sferlazzo, who is a Lampedusa-based visual artist, singer, and songwriter, as well as an active member of Ascausa, literally barefoot in Sicilian dialect, an association born in 2009 after the protest against the establishment of a reception center for migrants in Lampedusa. Giacomo Sferlazzo has literally salvaged one by one the remains of the shipwrecks and the landings that have happened on the shores of Lampedusa in order not only to save the memories of the migrants from oblivion and carelessness, but also to use them in the creation of new works of art. The main challenge associated with my research work is articulated as a displacement from the monolithic and essentialized ideas of the Mediterranean borders, which shapes this neighborhood as fortress Europe, to the historicity and of imaginations and practices of border making, and what I would call a political and performative method. This offers an analytical understanding of a variety of complex processes and practices of borderscaping that can explain how one thinks of borders and act on them in order to operationalize their heuristic potential through different analytic dimensions, such as politics and policies, practices, representations, perceptions, and interpretations. It is precisely the very fact that borderscaping and a border aesthetic approach greatly help us respond to conceptual but also methodological and practical challenges in critical border studies, to highlight the potential of these approaches to grasp and critically address the multi-level complexity of the border migration nexus, from the geopolitical level to the level of social practices, cultural productions, and everyday life, advancing borderscaping as a practice. In the late 80s and early 90s, the transition from the concept of border to that of bordering at the center of the so-called processual shift in border studies has encouraged a significant turning point in the reflection on borders. And yet I'm concerned with how the bordering perspective can be broadened to capture the many implications of constantly changing historical, political, and social border context. Given the backdrop of the shifting and often dramatic scenarios of what has been labeled the refugee migration crisis, this is not merely an academic question, but also has political implications. Anchored to a border aesthetic approach, the critical potential of borderscaping can be seen in the contribution that the notion gives to developing a broader understanding of the contemporary speciality of politics in the Mediterranean, thereby elaborating on the alternative geopolitical imaginations, social and spatial imaginaries, cultural images, and practical strategies to pursue them. This contribution is not only due to the fact that borderscaping approach allows for the modern state-centric geopolitical order to be called into question, which, for instance, the concept of bordering does as well. Beyond this, however, borderscaping also encourages an understanding of the multidimensional, epistemic, spatial, and temporal complexity of borders, which are dislocating, relocating, and proliferating in a variety of social and political arenas, thereby showcasing borders as a resource in terms of the construction of alternative border imaginaries beyond the metaphor of the line in the sand. I argue that the borderscaping approach might offer us the opportunity for investigating borders at multiple levels. Forced borderscaping facilitates the analysis of the border's normative dimension, that is, a critical assessment of the ethical, legal, and empirical premises and arguments used to justify particular cognitive and experiential regimes on which border policies are articulated. But this implies the consideration that borders also involve struggles consisting of multiple resistance strategies against hegemonic discourses and control practices. In this regard, Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nelson mobilized the concept of borderscapes in their reflection to highlight the conflicts faced when making, crossing, and inhabiting borders, as well as the tensions and struggle that play a decisive role in their constitution. Hence, borderscaping involves a processual ontology of borders that can be productively connected to what Thomas Nail calls in his volume Theory of the Border, border kenopower, defining the history of the border as a history of social motion, at the same time describing kenopolitics as the politics of movement. Hence, the borderscape notion fosters an understanding of borders as paradoxical structures that are both markers of belonging and places of becoming, where new forms of political belonging and becoming can be expressed and acted, opening up the way to new forms of political agency that challenge the intrinsic limits of modern political subjectivity. Being more than a mere trendy neologism, the borderscaping approach provides an analytical gateway to broadening and widening the conceptual and methodological potential of bordering in order to understand the multidimensional and dialogical nature of border making. I would argue that borderscaping fosters a productive understanding of border imaginaries and the border migration nexus by raising three arguments which remain understudied in critical border studies, at the same time showcasing the potential of a border aesthetic approach for rethinking, acting, and inhabiting borders under contemporary globalization. These three arguments are the politics aesthetic nexus, the time print of borders, or what geographer Nick Megoran has called the biographies of borders, and borderscaping as an inherently political and performative method. I give attention here to the politics aesthetic nexus, which is at the heart of borderscaping's formulation and enables me to critically examine the other two main analytical axes along which the potential of the borderscaping approach is expressed, showcasing the paramount importance of fostering a political and performative method in the study of borders. So let's start from the politics aesthetic nexus. This consideration regarding the politics aesthetic nexus, which is at the heart of the borderscaping formulation, have a close relationship with the 5 dimensions of global cultural flows that Arjuna Padurai defines as ethnoscapes, mediascapes, technoscapes, financescapes, and ideoscapes. As shown by Padurai, his choice of the suffix scape is because it expresses the fluid and uneven form of this landscape of globalization. As a result, it is impossible to think of globalization as a multidimensional, to think of globalization as a multidimensional process that requires an alternative spatial rendering. In line with Appadurai's reflection, the borderscape concept brings the vitality of borders to our attention, revealing that the border is by no means a static line, but a mobile and relational space. The interaction between politics and aesthetics in which the borderscape arises is revealed by the etymology of the suffix scape. The etymological evolution of scape highlights indeed that the notion entails two meanings. The notion of borderscaping is not only concerned with an artistic representation, reducing the borderscape to a visible place, which refers to its modern aesthetic image. It is also concerned with the sense of creative work, shaping and carving, arising from and being part of a political project of making that highlights the ways in which the borderscape shapes political subjectivities in a particular manner. Borderscapes are not at all detached from the material dimension of borders in a kind of postmodern fashion. On the contrary, the double etymology of the notion allows border representations and practices to be redirected through the very connection between politics and aesthetics in which borderscape originate. By bringing the interactions between the political and aesthetical implication of the border migration nexus to the foreground, borderscaping counterpoints spatio-temporal topologies of the modern territorial imaginary and its Euclidean geometry, reaffirming the link between a multidimensional territoriality of borders based on an interpretation of them as constructed, experienced, interpreted, and contested by human beings, and politicalness. Borderscaping raises a relevant argument that is often under-theorized, that political implications of border imaginaries are closely interweaved with aesthetic activity. In other words, constructing the world is always an aesthetic activity. Aesthetic languages mirror, oftentimes calibrates, and sometimes also reroute the processes by which borders materialize in the real world. This corresponds to what the French philosopher Jacques Rancière calls a dialogue between politics and aesthetics on the partition of the sensible that regulates what is visible, what can be said, and who can speak. The relationship between politics and aesthetics can be conceived as a tension between the policing of a particular distribution of the sensible and the constant struggle of subversive and progressive redistribution. The borderscaping lens allows borders to gain a novel political sense, opening up the way to encourage new forms of political participation and subjectivity that call for a more nuanced analysis of the working of border regimes, as well as for the inclusion of the plurality of agencies at work in the ordinary complexity of border sites and the multiplicity of their border narratives and practices. From this perspective, borderscaping undertakes a relevant role in despectacularizing narratives and images of borders presented in the media, and borderscapes can be regarded as sites where in/visibilities can be negotiated beyond the spectacularization of Mediterranean borderscapes. The borderscaping approach fosters a critical rethinking of the complex relationship between border regimes and regimes of invisibility, showing the intersection between processes of invisibility, power, lived experience, and materiality. Advancing an understanding of borders beyond their spectacularization, this reinterpretation can be achieved only through attention to the genealogical dimension of the border migration nexus that overcomes an historical biases which besets much of the political and mass media discourse on the present political and socio-cultural border migration challenges. This leads us to consider the relevant implication of borderscaping not only as a concept, but also as a method. I would argue that we should pay particular attention to the political and performative dimension of this methodological approach. The borderscaping approach provides a multi-sided rendering of borders in terms of space. It also encompasses the tensions between the different actors, time locations, and modalities that are involved in making the Mediterranean border. This is in support of what Mezzadra and Nelson have pointed out, that the question of border as method is something more than methodological. It is above all a question of politics. Method is as much about acting on the word as it is about knowing it. Through the borderscaping lens, it seems possible to rethink contemporary border imaginaries, practicing what Michael Herzfeld has defined as militant middle ground, that is an in-between fertile field of connections and intersections that cut across academic theory and applied practice, global design, regional and local histories, political and territorial borders, which are related to the exercise of modern state sovereignty, and boundaries as internal social categorizations, which are related to the politics of identity. Drawing attention to bordering processes involving a wide range of actors with a focus on everyday micro-practices, the concept of borderscapes liberates the border from the burden of state-centric territorial traps and opens up new possibility to interrogate the ordinary functioning of bordering processes and practices. This implies that attention should also be devoted to subjective political experiences of bordering in the wider social context. Indeed, it is precisely in subjective experiences that one could trace concurrent processes of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of borders, which reflect the dynamic and shifting unfolds concerning the border migration nexus, moving beyond the structure versus agency dichotomy. The borderscape approach favors a performative viewpoint on borders that also brings together the concept of performance and the notion of performativity. This last concept relates to performances, highlighting their political implications and mainly connecting performances to a critical reflection on the exertion of power. Different performances of sovereignty co-produce the borderscape, where they can be found in a dynamic spatial and temporal relationship. At the same time, they are negotiated, resisted, and countered by counter-hegemonic bordering practices acted on by a plurality of actors beyond the hegemonic nature of the sovereign state. Accordingly, by overcoming the spatio-temporal topologies of the modern territorialist imaginary, it is critical to look not at the binaries produced through powers versus resistances, but at the in-between to understand what the borderscaping processes reveal. If images and narratives of the border spectacle undertake a crucial role in depoliticizing and naturalizing political and social phenomena, as they visibilize border inhabitants, border crossers, but not as subjects, migrants, civil society are visibilized, but not necessarily given subjectivity. By bringing subjectivity, back to the foreground as a crucial aspect of social and political life, the borderscaping approach might contribute in de-essentializing and repoliticizing the border migration nexus and the migrant condition, reaffirming the relevance of a political and performative method. My conceptual and methodological consideration here speak directly to my multi-sited ethnographic research in the Italian-Tunisian borderscape, zooming in the urban space of Mazara del Vallo in Sicily and its relations with the city of Mahdia in Tunisia. Gazing into the history of the relationship between the urban borderscapes of Mazara and Mahdia tell us about a process that Nahar ben Yehoyada has described as progressive Mediterraneization in the borderland in the Channel of Sicily. This process explains how a place becomes more intertwined in a network of connection and movements with other places in or around the Mediterranean. The Mediterraneization perspective helps us grasp the complexity of the Italian-Tunisian borderscape by encompassing different sociocultural, political, economic, legal and historical locations, where a space of negotiating actors and not only the states, discourses and practices is articulated. Among the different actors involved in this research, particular attention has been devoted to second generation and third generation young migrants whose families are originally from Tunisia, mainly from Mahdia, as well as to young people whose families are originally from Italy and who are now living together in Mazara del Vallo. Encouraging young people's active engagement represents a first important condition that must be met for new forms of political agency and subjectivity to happen in the Mediterranean. However, this agency can be grasped thanks to a research methodology capable of giving public visibility, taking up here Hannah Arendt's ideas of public visibility back to young people's experiences, thereby counterpointing pathologies of invisibility on which the border spectacle in the Mediterranean is based. Taking up Arendt's idea of visibility, the possibility for political participation depends on a form of political involvement that she terms public visibility. To be publicly visible, however, can only be seen as progressive as long as other identity markers remain invisible. To be naturally invisible but publicly visible means to be able to enunciate political articulation that are received independently from involuntary markers of racial, ethnic, class, or other belonging. This makes public visibility and natural invisibility fundamental precondition for citizens' active participation in politics. Due to the pathologies of invisibility on which the border spectacle in the Mediterranean is based, migrants suffer from a public invisibility that is wedded to natural visibility. Public invisibility takes away the agency of political subjects and reduces them to a set of natural traits that are articulated within a public sphere of appearance by others. In line with these considerations, the research with young people has used an interdisciplinary qualitative methodology, bringing together social and human sciences. Adopting this methodological approach, we have organized educational workshop activities with different age groups of young people, both in Mazara and Mahdia. Mixed collaborative and participatory visual approaches have been used to outline possible tactics for negotiating regimes of invisibility in an attempt to give public visibility back to young people. I carry out a collaborative ethnographic research, which also serves as a tool to explore the potential of visual methods and media for developing a public anthropology, bridging the gap between border knowledge and practice, between academic research and social intervention, to foster innovative policies capable of promoting a more comprehensive understanding of bordering in contemporary Europe and beyond. During the workshop activity, great emphasis was given to aesthetic, narrative, and visual methods and media. Specifically, narrative visual methods were used: autophotography, short videos, drawings, photo elicitation, participatory mapping and counter mapping. In addition to a variety of other qualitative research methods, including walking expedition and shadowing, using a phenomenological approach in anthropology. Both the topics and the methods of the educational workshop activities intending to operationalize the politics aesthetic nexus in which Borderscape originate. This also enables young people to no longer think of the border as a divisive linear geometry, but as a constructed, inhabited, and relational space, as a space where new political subjectivities and agency can be shaped, and therefore as a space of political opportunity. Special attention has been devoted to the videographic method. The research activities undertaken with the young people in both Italy and Tunisia have been shot and included in the film Hudud al-Bar, which is an Arabic expression that literally means the borders of the sea. The documentary has been in part directly shot by the youth themselves, and in this sense is a participatory documentary film. The close connection between the borderscaping approach and the border aesthetic approach and the application of a performative and political method also emerge from the ways in which the research results have been disseminated both at academic and non-academic level. Indeed, the exhibition Hudud al-Bar, I confini del mare, has been conceived, in addition to the documentary film, as a traveling tool for disseminating research results. The majority of photographs, iconographic and different types of audiovisual materials in the exhibition come from the educational workshop activities undertaken with the young people. Coming to what I would call not an ending but a beginning, as my aim is not to give answers, but instead I would like to pose new questions and new challenges to the interdisciplinary debate within critical border studies. I would say that both ethnographic research and the making of the film highlight a agency of young Tunisian migrants and their Italian friends living in Mazara del Vallo that originates from inhabiting the Italian-Tunisian borderscape in between Mazara and Mahdia. Young people probably can be considered as the precursors and creators of new and original forms of citizenship, a Mediterranean-inspired citizenship based on a deep relationship, which is often denied by modern state-centric political geographies between the political and emotional dimension. Young people sketch a kind of counter-image of the Italian-Tunisian borderscape through a resistance that is not necessarily enacted through organized movement, but rather through a political presence in everyday Mediterranean context. It is a resistance that acts on the Italian-Tunisian borderscape through imagining experiences and performing in the Mediterranean neighborhood. This new form of citizenship was expressed by many of young Tunisians we met during the research. For instance, here you have a quote from an interview with a 16-year-old Tunisian girl who said, "Each of us feels to be a bit Tunisian, a bit Italian, and a bit Mediterranean. For me, it is difficult to trap myself in an identity category that does not change and has rigid boundaries. I feel to belong in an equal way to my two countries. This is identity. It is a multidimensional and shifty. This multiplicity of belonging is, in my opinion, more representative of contemporary identities than a model based on a fixed and unchanging belonging." Or another example, in this text accompanying a drawing of the Italian-Tunisian borderscape by a 16-year-old Tunisian girl, she wrote that it would be great if the United States of the Mediterranean were founded, and added that Mazara is closer to Tunisia than it is to Milan or Bergamo. Or another example again, another 16-year-old Tunisian girl wrote in her text that "I feel like a girl who is half Italian and half Tunisian and who lives in the middle of the Mediterranean, in between Sicily and Tunisia." Or a Tunisian guy, aged 18 years old, wrote that "I feel attached to both Tunisia and Italy, as my family lives in Tunis and my friends are in Mazar." In this regard, it is worth referring also to the simplified ways in which the so-called Kasbah quarter in Mazara is presented in dominant political and mass media narratives and images that conflict with the complex image of the Kasbah as described by young people inhabiting the transnational urban space of Mazara through their day-to-day multiple experience. The Kasbah is a decayed quarter of the old town center founded by the Arabs during their occupation of Sicily. The Kasbah became a symbol of the foreign presence in Mazara and is presented now by local and national media, as well as by local authorities, as a dangerous place, where the presence of foreigners is associated with different forms of microcriminality in the quarter and threatens the personal and social sense of security of the Italian inhabitants of the Sicilian town. Yet, it is worth considering the ways in which young people's narratives and images question this monolithic representation of the Kasbah. Although the dominant mass media and political imaginaries of the Kasbah influence young people's own ideas about the quarter, these youth are able to construct an alternative image of the Kasbah through their mundane experiences, which yield valuable insight into the complexity of this place, as well as offers people means for better understanding the places where they live, go to school, work, shop, and socialize. In this regard, interesting example can be drawn from the documentary film. In some scenes in the film, I asked a question about the Casbah to an 11-year-old Italian girl attending 4th grade in the Paolo Borsellino Junior High School in Mazara. Here I reported the answer that I got from this girl. This part of conversation drawn from the film help us understand that dominant narratives dealing with the Casbah make the image of the quarter so stereotypical that real configuration of the neighborhood are rendered invisible and absent in young people's imaginaries of the place. But during an educational workshop, we asked students to identify such places which were very important for them and without which Mazara could no more be recognized as their town. Interestingly enough, most of the young people said that it was very important for them to keep the Casbah. In this regard, it is worth quoting what the same Italian girl whom I interviewed in the film said during the workshop. I would like to keep the Casbah in Mazara because my Tunisian friends live there, and therefore I don't want to exclude it. If I exclude it, it would be as if they went away too, so I want to keep it. A similar view of the Casbah was expressed by young students attending the 4th and 5th grade in the Daniele Aiello in junior high school in Mazara, who participated in other collaborative workshop activities on landscape as an intercultural mediator. Specifically, I would like to refer to some relevant examples taken from drawing and participatory mapping activities. In drawing their participatory map of Mazara, the youth gave a significant role to the Casbah. In contrast to official maps of the town, the participatory map made by Italian and Tunisian young people living together in Mazara shows the Casbah as the historical and present art of the town, where its most important places are located, and gives the town its peculiar Mediterranean urban identity in between Italy and Tunisia. At the same time, these places in the Casbah are identified as the most important ones in Mazara by the youth, who said several times during the discussion that Mazara would have no more been their town if there hadn't been those places. In this way, it is shown once again the relevance of the political and performative approach that the borderscape enables. This does not mean that one must neglect the violence of the border regime and its imposition, nor the difficulties in putting this new horizon of citizenship into practice. Rather, we inevitably need to look at the spaces where new forms of political agency are shaped by revealing a horizon of hope through which it will be possible to move towards a new productive understanding of borders and the border migration nexus, which will extend beyond the line, beyond the contour of present political categories. This move also calls for an applied, committed, and engaged research capable of recovering its inherently political dimension, moving beyond the simplistic yet dominant interpretations of the border migration nexus, which make us trapped in the politics of fear towards a politics of hope. It is precisely in this change towards the possibility of alternative border future that one could locate the specific contribution of my argument about the potential of the borderscaping approach. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chiara. This is really interesting. Also, the fact that the children have a different perspective, so the centrality of the borderscape in their world compared to what we think as a region, a region that is not central at all. So it really depends in which way you see the place and what happened there, not the encounters, and you change your perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to try to pluralize our gaze. Also, as a researcher within interdisciplinary border studies, is so much needed, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today, because I think that your gaze, which is also a kind of historical, genealogical depth gaze, it's very important and could bring an important contribution to the interdisciplinary debate on these topics.
Indeed, yeah, we need to, of course, to reorganize and adjust this kind of theory to our evidence, which is not always easy. So particularly if you are, far deep into history, and so things are quite different, and the evidence that we have it's clearly different. So guys, we are not a lot of people, so please show your face and start to ask and discuss with Chiara about borderscapes. Oren, yes, please.
Well, first, Professor Brambilla, I really want to thank you for this really wonderful and stimulating talk. In many ways, we often joke that Egyptology is like 20 years behind all of the other disciplines. So to have a chance to get a very, very contemporary, really dynamic approach to border studies is very much a treat for us. One of the questions I wanted to ask, and I have many, but I'll just start with one, is I really love this idea about sort of the borderscape approach. Not only does it have sort of the ability to look at kind of hegemonic narratives of borders, but within sort of this idea about counter-hegemonic narratives, as you were saying, that you can have a plurality of different perspectives. One can consider the borderscape not merely as a site of resistance, but for a space where new political ideas can emerge. And so one of my questions, we're all extremely jealous of the kind of the ethnographic work that you've done. It's really incredible. Of course, we don't have the same luxury. So one of the questions I had was, what kinds of, in addition to kind of these participatory elements, where else do you tend to look for what we would describe as like counter-hegemonic narratives of the borderscape? Or is that something that really you feel is limited to sort of these ethnographic interviews? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I can imagine it's not an easy task for you to do participatory research if you are looking at the past. So this is difficult. But I would like to go back to a conversation I had with Maria just yesterday. And she mentioned, for instance, rupestric art and the way in which the ancient Egypt people used to represent the border and the sense of the border they had. So I think that, for instance, rupesteric art could be a trace that you can follow, in order to make emerge also views from others. At the same time, I used hegemonic and counter-hegemonic borderscape, but I at the same time don't like so much these contrapositions, because I think it's important to move forward and go and abandon these binary oppositions. Because I think it's important. It's important to try to represent a multiplicity and plurality of voices that are not necessary in opposition, but they are co-present in the borderscape that we investigate, even if they are in the past. For example, Maria told me about the Nubian community, and it would be great to find a way to give voice and visibility to this part of the past, in Egypt. Always, we know that there are also problems regarding politics and power, and okay, so.
Indeed, yeah. It's one of the main interesting point that you raise. The public invisibility of minorities in our case would be the Nubians nowadays, but also in the past. What the different, let's say, scale of importance between the Egyptian side and the Nubian side, and how we could raise more visibility to the minority, or how to read the archaeological record that we have in order to do that, which is not always easy. So indeed, the rock art could be an interesting medium. Also because it was used at one point, is used by the central power, the royal power, to address and to communicate, and also to build, to make the border there. So that could be an interesting media to be used.
I'd also just add that to me it's particularly exciting in the sense that sure, you get more rock art in certain periods than others, but I mean, you can find rock art from 5 years ago or something that we see. There's sort of a continuous, or near continuous record in a way that there isn't always for us.
That's true. That's true. Questions? The others? Do you have any question? Any comment? Oren, do you have another question?
I don't know. I have a curiosity.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are contemporary Nubian artists, street artists maybe, who are doing or working street on walls, on public walls, and I don't know.
Well, as a matter of fact, the Nubians had always decorated their houses. So the wall of their houses traditionally were also always decorated, and they keep doing that. Also in Egypt, they do that. For instance, when they go to the Mecca to pray and they do the journey, they tend to paint on the outer walls of their houses the journey. So maybe you have the plane telling you that they went to Mecca and blah blah blah. So it's also a way to show that they went to Mecca. So from religious symbolism. No? That's important because it makes you also part of that kind of group. So it's an identity, and also an elite that was able to go to Mecca.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they have this kind of tradition, not much after the displacement, we have to say, because for two reasons. I mean, one is that the majority of the Nubian communities that now are displaced in the Komumbo region, so north of Aswan, where the houses that they get from the Egyptian government were Egyptian style houses, modern houses, so squared, made of cement, this kind of stuff. So they didn't feel much of a connection with that kind of architecture because their traditional architecture was completely different. But in some cases, they still do that. So there is this kind of tradition. Otherwise, yeah, we have rock inscriptions and rock drawings that are from recent times. I mean, they are modern. We have a motorcycle, for instance, an airplane. We have actually we have an inscription in hieroglyphic that is clearly made nowadays. So it's modern, but it was made using the hieroglyphic signs. And they're used as an alphabet in the same ways as the modern papyrus, for the tourist is made.
Yeah.
So when they write, in hieroglyphic, so it's clearly somebody who knows how to write in hieroglyphic for the tourists. And it just went and did, the same thing, but on a rock surface. So this is really very, very interesting to see this kind of multiple way of expression that is not traditional. You wouldn't expect that, but still they do it. So
thank you.
Who is going to do it? So who is the one doing this kind of that probably also would be interesting to understand. In our case, for instance, these kind of expressions are in close to Nubian villages. So who knows if, the local people are going around and just trying. They see the rock art and they want to, to emulate.
This is so interesting.
Yeah, it's indeed, yeah, it's something that would be also interesting to develop as because it's clearly a continuum. There is a sort of tradition, of using rock art and rock inscriptions, because rock art is very common from prehistoric times. So let's say till the beginning of the dynastic period. Then it's less important. It's still there, but it's less important. Is replaced from the Egyptian side with rock inscriptions. So you get more that than. So it's still a visual representation, because then most of these inscriptions are with hieroglyphic signs. So, but it's a different kind of visual representation. It's more elite, I guess. Not everybody can read hieroglyphic. So even if you see the inscription, you are not able really to understand what's going on there. Maybe the only thing that you can get is, oh, this has been made by, by somebody that is top class. So it's not for me, or it's. So it would be interesting to understand what kind of perception, the local communities there could have had of this kind of more elite, let's say, markers in the landscape. Of course, the rock art is more straightforward, because if I represent a boat or an animal, or, at least I know what it is. I can understand what it is. And it's more likely that I also understand the symbolism behind it. So it should be more, let's say, communal as a means of expression, let's say.
in some ways, especially when we're talking about these rock inscriptions, but certainly I think we can extend it to the earliest moment when we can start thinking about the formation of a border in that region. Like one of the topics, the concepts that you touched on in your talk, Professor Brambilla, is this idea about invisibility and kind of, and I don't, and at first I would just like to invite you maybe to talk a little bit more about the concept if you'd like. But one of the things that's really interesting to me about it is thinking about this through the lens of a more ancient, in more ancient states, where one, there's sort of this this impetus towards kind of performing the border, performing a borderscape through the use of these inscriptions that very much are not for everyone. Sometimes, most of the time, they're visible, they're easily accessible, but sometimes they're quite high up on a rock face, and we can think about audiences that maybe aren't even necessarily human in the first place, divine, something else, but they're not necessarily accessible to everyone, and so that comes to mind. But then also this idea that for sort of one striking difference to me between the modern borderscapes in this era of this information age is the state really has sort of, not that it's all encompassing or anything, but there's sort of a more conscious effort to, I don't know, it's not necessarily silence certain political participants, but it's, in many ways, when I think about the ancient pharaonic state, it's sort of this desperate grasp to figure out what is going on all the time. And so in some cases, I just wanted to raise the possibility that some of these actors, it was probably advantageous to not be visible, in part just because you can escape sort of some of the grasping, more extractive elements of the pharaonic state. And so I just wanted to bring that up as well. But mostly I just wanted to, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that concept and some of the ways you've applied it.
Yeah, it is a concept that comes from Hannah Arendt. I don't know if you are familiar with this political philosopher, Hannah Arendt. And I find it is very helpful to understand the way in which migrants, but not only migrants. I have worked with the young people because you see, migrants are not the only one who are rendered invisible in the public sense and who are living the borderland. Because if you think, for example, about Lampedusa, Lampedusa as a community who is living there and is experienced a lot of problems in living on this border island, but never you have heard the media talking about the Lampedusa inhabitants. So I think that first of all, it's important to, going back again to what I said at the first at the beginning, it's very much important to try to use a concept, in this case visibility, but I don't use visibility versus invisibility, but in/visibility. So it's the same term. It depends on the side in which you use this concept. Is helping us to pluralize, no, our way to look at the borderscape. This is one point, and the other important point is this difference between public visibility and natural visibility, because if we think about the media representation of the Euro-African borderscapes, not only the Italian, Tunisian, but also others, you see that migrants are there, migrants are visibilized, okay, but they are visibilized as bodies, not as subjectivities, no? They are there just as bodies, numbers, arrows that are represented on the maps, but they are not there as human beings that have a subjectivity and therefore also agency, no? What I try to do, for example, with young people in Mazara and Mahdia, and also in my work in Lampedusa, is to find a way to give back public visibility to, in this case, young people who are living there, but also with migrants, it's the same. I think it's very, very important, and also to make them alive, because another thing that I notice is that most of the time people who are natural visible but public invisible are dead bodies, while there are also a lot of live living bodies, no, going on in that borderscape and in between Europe and Africa. So I think it's very important to reflect on this nexus, a complex nexus between public and natural in/visibility. Because most of the time it is simplified, no? It's not assumed in its complexity.
Yeah, that to me is such a really great point, and really something that, you know, I'm just thinking about current research in our field, and, you know, oftentimes when we talk about different cultures, there's a very very popular and really stimulating book that was published recently called The Dawn of Everything, where they spend a lot of time talking about this idea of schismogenesis and cultures defining, you know, themselves in opposition to one another. But what I love about this invisibility concept is it gives, yes, there's space for that, but there's also space for other ideas where not everything has to be completely oppositional, but that there can be there's room for different ideas about how these, say in our case, sometimes Egypt and Nubia are interacting, that isn't just we're this way so that we're different from them because that way. There's this mix which fits much more with a lot of the evidence that we have on the ground. And this one of the other things I wanted to just mention is I love that there's the capacity for the Borderscape to incorporate, as you're saying, natural spaces, whether this is, you know, sort of the Mediterranean Sea, various cityscapes, Mazara, Lampedusa, or in our case, some of these sort of islands in the first cataract region where it becomes very difficult to cross.
It's very important your point, Oren, because as I said, I don't want that Borderscape is considered like a kind of postmodern thing, no? So disconnected from the materiality, no, of the border. The materiality of the border is still there. And so when I refer to the etymological evolution of the suffix scape, and I said that it's not only the representation, not the modern image of the border, but it also involves this idea of shape and curve, no? So an act of making the border. For me, it's very important that the material form of the border is also part of Borderscape. So thank you for your comment, because it's very important. So
Lauren, who unfortunately had to go away, she left a question for you. So she's asking, first of all, thank you for the lecture, it was very interesting, but she had to go away. So from an archaeological perspective, it is difficult, if not impossible, to view children in the archaeological record, especially if a borderscape is controlled by political elite. Are there identifiable visual markers or categories of visual markers produced by state-controlled parties that address positively or negatively children in border regions?
In the regions where I have worked, I never encountered this kind of narratives or documents. But it's a good point.
Yeah, it's also going back to what Oren was saying about schismogenesis. It's true that that's a concept that works best in the center, not at the periphery. So probably if we were talking about, you know, the capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis, probably there you will have a much more diversified, let's say, way of being than in a border region, because indeed the border region becomes a central place for both, let's say, also from, let's say, from the other side, so in our case, Nubia. And so in this sense, you have a less clear, let's say, process of schismogenesis in these areas, no? And actually you have a more fluid identity and more complex way of also creating new identities. So where, and in fact, we have what we can see also from the archaeological record is that the 4th millennium material culture that you have in our region is not the same as the one that you have farther north, for instance. There is a lot more influence from the south, like, you know, objects, traditions. So it's more mixed up, no? And so this is also interesting. It really depends where you are, and then you can get, you know, a different kind of aspect of the same process.
It's also important to consider that margins are never marginal. So even if they are represented as marginal, they are not.
Indeed, yeah.
So
yeah, no, indeed. Well, in our case, it's also interesting because we are trying to better understand how it happened that at one point you not only get a territorial state or an early form of territorial state of some kind, but also an early form of geopolitical boundary. So how did they build something like that? How did they, what kind of process, what kind of agency or acts they put together, not to make something that, and Chiara was asking me yesterday, I was telling her about the two terms used by ancient Egyptians to define borders and let's say more natural borders, statical borders, and borders made by the political power. The earliest evidence of this, of the presence of these two terms, and of course I'm not a philologist, so I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that there is not much evidence in the Old Kingdom, probably later on. But for instance, the rock inscriptions of Men-Ra that we saw, this 5th dynasty, so it's the end, let's say, of the Old Kingdom, more or less. So the end also of the 3rd millennium. It's probably the first evidence clear where pharaohs say, I'm coming here because I want to talk with the leaders of the other territories. And it clearly states in his own way that that's a border. This is where my territory stops, ends, and this is where the somebody else is starting. So this is probably the earliest time that we can see in our area that indeed they are referring to a clear border. Otherwise, yeah, for many centuries after the unification of Egypt, there is nothing there that we can see now. There is attested in written sources or visual sources or in the archaeological record that is really expressing this kind of notion of, you know, being a sort of, first of all, a sort of property, no? In a sense, this is mine, this is part of my, and also a political, let's say, division between one and the other. But it's very difficult to understand, you know, what kind of, how it happened, when it happened, and why it happened. So what are the different, you know, elements that were put together? But you work also in other borders areas, no? Also in Africa.
In Africa, yes. I started working in ex-French Africa, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Niger, because there is a very big transboundary national park, which is called the W National Park, because of the Niger River, which make this kind of W rivers, and I worked there. And then during my PhD, I worked in Angola and Namibia, along the Angola-Namibia border with the Kwanyama ethnic groups. Yeah, and I was also, yesterday during our conversation with Maria, I was also mentioning the importance of making reference to the words that this community used to name the border. Because also the Kwanyama people, like what happened in Egypt, they have two different words to name the border. One is a very ancient one, and it was used before the arrival of the Europeans, and was used to name traditional borders, borders that were not seen like a line, but like a zone, and like a zone that was represented with natural elements, I mean river or lake or big trees, and so on. Then when in the second half of the 19th century, when the German colonization started in Namibia, they introduced this new term in Oshikwanyama language that was used to identify the border as a line, no? A border that you cannot see in reality. When you live along the border, you don't see it. You see it where in the maps that were imposed by the colonizers, or it's very interesting because this idea of the modern border as a linear geometry exists on maps, but not in reality, not in the real life experience of people. So I think this is a very interesting also point.
How this group was affected and by the arrival of the Europeans? How did
and the group was divided because part of the group, the majority of the group, is now living in Namibia, while part of the group is in Angola. And you have to imagine that entire villages were divided by the border. So it happened that part of the family, the same family, became suddenly Angolan citizenships and others were Namibian citizenships. So in terms of identity, this brought a kind of complexification of the Kwanyama identity. What I usually say in my publication on this is that the border was not just a division, no, but also brought a new complexity in the identity of these people who were not just divided by the border, but the fact that the border was introduced also caused a new complexity in terms of identity of these people. And I think this is very important to consider, because otherwise we risk to represent African people like victims without any agency, while they were there and they, okay, the border was imposed in a violent way, we know, but at the same time they were there. So they also had an active part in the process. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Do you see any, let's say, particularly in Africa, because the kind of tradition, it's probably more similar to ours, although there are many millennia of difference, but probably compared to modern, let's say, European situation. Do you see any pattern for the local communities, so the way they react or the way they rearrange themselves, no? So that they find a new way of dealing with this kind of geopolitical institution that they didn't know before and is imposed on them. Is there any pattern that you can see, or any kind of, you know,
patterns that are repeated in different situations?
Yeah, in different
okay. It very much depends on the type of colonialism that was applied, indirect rule or direct rule, for instance, because depending on the type of colonization that these people experienced, there was also a different role played by local traditional authorities. In case of direct rule, these authorities were suppressed. While in the case of indirect rule, it was different, because these local authorities had a very active role, and they acted together with the colonialist in imposing, for example, the border. They wanted it somehow. So you see, it very much depends on the context, on the type of colonization that was applied. And then Namibia is a very unusual kind of, as a kind of a very unusual colonial history, because Namibia was colonized first by the Germans. And the German colonialism has a lot of special, peculiar traits that in some ways render this colonialism very similar to Italian colonialism. But then Namibia also experienced a kind of different colonization from another African state, South Africa. So it's the only state in Africa that was colonized by another African state, South Africa. Indeed, Namibia became independent in 1990. It was the last African country to become independent from South Africa in 1990. So
Well,
also the
any different reaction or let's say interplay with the local communities between the colonialists from Europe, so from outside their, let's say, greater world, or was the same kind of attitude?
I don't know if you have understood the question.
Because
yeah.
I mean, for sure, there were more similar, a more similar background between the Namibians and the South Africans. So they probably share more tradition, no?
No,
at all.
No, because
so you
South
don't see
Africa,
the difference.
No, you have the white community, no, the Boerian, and
so
it's no.
Yeah, okay.
I had another question. If no one else has one, I'm happy to keep going. But one point that I find really interesting about your work, Chiara, is like the ability of the Borderscape to sort of point to non-linear imaginaries of territoriality. And one of the things that I think we wrestle with is it's not that the ancient Egyptians don't have a concept of what a line is, you know, when they're talking about fields and things like that. That is very much apparent, but it's at least to me, when we're looking at their words for boundaries and the way that they actually operate in the places that the state is claiming as a border, it doesn't necessarily seem linear at all. And I was wondering if, well, one, if you could point to some of the ways that your own research has kind of pointed towards non-linear borders and boundaries, and also just to hear if you think that there are ways that sort of studies of these kind of, I want to be careful about the terms that I choose here, but it's almost as if there's a different way of imagining what a state is for the ancient Egyptians compared to, you know, 18th or 19th century France or something like that. It's I think quite different. And so I was wondering if you felt in some ways applying some of these concepts to states in different places in time that might lead us to new imaginings of what a border can be in the future, as they're challenged by any number of trans-border forces now.
This is what was at stake of the educational workshop I did with the young people, because I tried to work with them in order to understand how they imagine the border. So I asked them to draw the border as it is in their imaginaries. And then I also asked them to tell me the words that they had in their mind when they think about the borders. And I obtained very different answers. So during the brainstormings, they said, okay, if I think at the border, I think of a line, state, mountain, division, and other things, but mainly line, division, and so on, mountains, river, natural elements, and so on. What was very interesting is what emerged from the drawings of the young people, because there, in some way, they escape from the borders of reality, and they could represent another kind of border, another kind of imaginaries. And it's interesting because, for example, a Tunisian guy represented the border as a cell phone. For me, this is very interesting. And why the cell phone? it's important because when you think about the border, you think when you take the ferry to go back to Tunisia during the summer holiday, and the first thing that he does is to change the SIM card in his cell phone. So when I think at the border, the first thing that represents his border imaginary is a cell phone. I think this is interesting because it's a kind of counter image of the borderscape. And it's a piece that can be helpful to construct this alternative, imagining of the borderscape. Yeah, and I remember when I worked with fishermen in Mazara, and one of them represents the border as a snake, as a snake. Because also the fishermen are experiencing very, very badly in the Italian, Libyan, and Tunisian seascape, and so he drew the snake. So also the use of the metaphors is very interesting to constructing this dual imaginary, because we know that metaphors are not just rhetoric figures, but they contribute in creating our reality. So metaphors are a serious thing, not just something we use to write a good poetry. I mean, so.
That's right, yeah. Well, I think that probably rock art can be one of these metaphors used.
I think that rock art is a great, could be a great field.
Yeah. For instance, for most part of the fourth millennium, the rock art that is represented in Egypt, different areas of Egypt, but in ours, also in the Eastern Desert and in the, let's say, the desert mountains close to the Nile, are these hunting scenes where you can have the complete scene with the hunters that is chasing an animal, a wild animal, helped by dogs, for instance. And the wild animals can be, mostly are from the desert animals like ibexes, but it can be also some Nile animals like the crocodile or hippo, so this kind of animals. And the interpretation that we give is that this is a symbolic way of representing the control of the order over the chaos of nature, so the order of the political entity, the political system and the society over the chaos of the nature. So this can be, in a way, this kind of attitude is a metaphor of the control of this new elite, new system, political system that is developing. That is probably easier also to be understood by the local the people, by the majority of the people. So I'm controlling. Egypt has always been culture who has double meaning of everything. So there is life and death, black and white, the Nile Valley and the desert.
Order, chaos.
Order and chaos is one of the others.
Elites.
Yeah, so everything is order and chaos, and then there is one of the goddesses, goddess Maat. There is not the goddess of order, the goddess of. So it's really this kind of binary way of representing their world, their life, their also be conceptual system and behavioral system. So this could be one possible also way of marking, or representing these boundary regions, these boundary areas, also outside the Nile Valley, or because that is already a border for them. There is a great difference between the Nile Valley and the desert. And so they see that, it's visible, it's a perception that is clearly there. So, and that can be one way of representing that.
Yeah, and it's also a way to connect a territorial border with the multiplicity of symbolic and sociocultural boundaries which are crisscrossing the region. If I think to what you told me regarding the region, because I really don't know about it, but from what I can understand from your what you told me, I think it's very interesting.
It's a region that is, but we also have to think that the process of state formation and also border making is made by Egypt, but we cannot think of the Nubians or the people living in the desert nearby, as you said, being there and just waiting for the Egyptians to do what they wanted. So there should have been an interplay, an interaction between this kind of community. We can see some of this on the archaeological record. And we have to think that for sure there was a way of counterbalancing what the Egyptians wanted to do, or this kind of ideas of this is mine, and because this also creates a stronger, as we said before, schismogenesis, but also from an identity perspective. So if this is mine, and the Egyptians were very good in this, they always represents Egypt and the rest of the world. So the enemies were always the outsiders, the foreigners, their neighbors. So it doesn't matter if from the south, like the Nubians, or the north, like Mediterranean or Near Eastern. They are always represented as enemies. So the ancient Egypt had this kind of perception, of them being the center of the world, and the rest that is in the chaos. And so also the evil part, in this sense. So in a place like this one, and at the moment where this kind of attitude, this kind of process starts, so what are the kind of reaction from the others that at one point become, from being the same, become to be different in some way, or at least from an official point of view, So because then, the local perspective, maybe the bottom-up perspective, can be different, or actually it seems really different. So it's this is also an important point to evaluate. If you would give us any suggestion on how to apply the borderscape theory and to an archaeological context. So what we should look for, or trying to understand. So what kind of, of way also to apply this kind of theory?
It's a very big question. I don't know if I can find an answer in 2 minutes, I think. So I'm willing to reflect on this, but I think that some elements have been already highlighted, also starting from your comments. First of all, the importance of assuming that the border is not only in space, but also in time. And this is just already a very important thing to underline, because most of publication within international border studies are focusing on the speciality of borders and not on temporality of borders. So I find that this is a very important contribution that archaeologists can make to border studies. So the importance of understand that borders are not only in space but also in time. So, and also the fact that borders are multidimensional processes and not entities but processes, both in space and also in time. So this multidimensionality, this stratification of the border could be grasped only if you put on this kind of glasses like you have, that can go back to understand the contemporaneity. So I think this is a very important point. The second important point is this point of invisibility. And again, I think that your contribution could be very interesting, because you are working with something that has been invisibilized by the passing of the time. I mean, time has invisibilized, for example, the way in which Nubian reacted to the imposition of borders from the Egyptian power. And so, but this is a challenge for you and for your work. But I think that if you find a way to, contribute in how we can bring together this reflection on invisibility and temporality of borders. This could be a very, very interesting contribution that you can do. So,
yes. Is there much interest of in the border studies community to really see this kind of processes from a deeper perspective? So to put together, also aspects from or the let's say the evidence from the past to better understand also modern processes.
Things are changing. I mean, small steps are starting to be done, but border studies is still a community dominated by international relations and political geographers. So it's not easy. Even my work, okay, it has perceived in a positive way within critical border studies, but there is a part of international border studies that are more oriented to the classic ideas of the border as a geopolitical division and so on. So something is changing, and there is an interest in exploring new dimensions, new ways of research, and for instance, you mentioned the temporality of borders project in which I was involved. For example, this dimension of time is something that is emerging as important and relevant and to be discussed within border studies. So, and it's something that interests, for example, me very much.
Chiara, thank you very much for your presentation and your time, and we will definitely keep in touch, and let's hope that we can arrange for some in-presence meeting and talk more about borderscapes. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao.